In the early 19th century, the vast Russian Empire made an adventurous bid to colonize California, primarily in order to supply its Alaska colony with food. In 1812, the governing body of Russian Alaska, the Russian American Company, established a colony on the Sonoma coast known as Fort Ross. From Ross, the Russians hunted sea otters for their pelts and established 3 outlying agricultural settlements for the production of food. Although the Russians in California universally agreed that the country was temperate, beautiful, and rich in resources, their foothold at Fort Ross was underutilized for expanding further into the region. Due to the asset that California could have been to the Russian Empire, there were a few propositions in Fort Ross's history to expand the borders of Russian California from a small beachhead on the Sonoma coast to a proper colonial nation. In this video, I'll be explaining the motives and details of these plans, as well as why they ultimately never worked out. Besides the logistical problems of California being so far away from Russia's other imperial outposts, the Russian court in St. Petersburg worried that further expansion of the Ross colony would trigger a diplomatic crisis with Spain, who legally claimed all of California and had settled much of its coast. Then, after the Mexican War of Independence ended in 1821, Spanish California became a part of Mexico. If Russia wanted to expand their California colony, they would have to either cut a deal with Mexico or fight them for it. The Spanish-speaking peoples living in California, called Californios, generally disliked Mexican rule. The Franciscan missionaries that held most of the political power in California hated the secular Mexican government, and the soldiers that garrisoned California's meager defenses were rarely paid and under-equipped. Thus, not only was Mexican rule unpopular in California, Californios felt threatened that their country would be an easy target for conquest by foreign powers, particularly Britain and the United States. Because of Californio discontent against the Mexicans, it was not uncommon for Russians and Californios to unofficially discuss the possibility of California being ceded to the Russian Empire for protection. The Californios in the Bay Area and the Russians in Fort Ross had generally cordial relations, and the Californios were impressed by and envious of the help that Fort Ross received from its imperial motherland. In want of protection, many powerful Californios were more than open to the idea of joining the Russian Empire, and the first Russian in California to recognize this sentiment and aggressively lobby to capitalize upon it was a young man named Dmitry Zavalishyn. Dmitry Zavalishyn visited California in 1823 as a junior officer on a Russian ship, at the age of just 19. Zavalishyn was from an aristocratic family and a liberal man of the Enlightenment, an important detail that will come into play later. Upon seeing the weak state of California under Mexican rule and the country's potential to become the center of Russia's Pacific Empire, Zavalishyn hatched 2 schemes to expand Russian California. The first idea was the simple and total annexation of all of Alta California to Russia, from San Diego to Sonoma. Zavalishyn believed, in some ways correctly, that Mexican California was de facto independent, and that the Mexican central government would be powerless to stop the annexation. Such an aggressive proposition was predicated on this belief of a peaceful takeover with the consent of the Californios and the weakness of Mexican authority. Had this plan come to fruition, Zavalishyn had some ideas about the constitution of the new Russo-Spanish California. The Californios would have to abandon their 2 missions on the north side of the San Francisco Bay, San Rafael and San Francisco Solano, and refrain from creating their own settlements north of them, in effect splitting Russian California into a Russian north and a Californio south. Despite the establishment of this pale of settlement, Zavalishyn assured that Russians and Californios could still settle and integrate in each other's cultural regions and be obligated to defend each other. If a foreign power, pirates, or indigenous Californians attacked one culture, the other would have to join in its defense. Although passionate, Zavalishyn recognized that total annexation might have been too unrealistic to pursue, and also entertained a more conservative plan for California. Because the Californios were concerned about conquest by the United States, a concern that was ultimately warranted, Zavalishyn thought it would be far more agreeable for the Californios to make a deal officially allowing Russian California to expand northward and eastward without annexing any California land, thus forming a buffer state against American expansion. The 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty between the United States and Spain recognized America's claims on the Pacific coast north of 42 degrees north latitude, meaning California, de jure, shared a border with the United States. Here, Zavalishyn proposed that Russian California be expanded northward to the 42nd parallel, eastward to the west bank of the Sacramento River, and southward to the north shores of the San Francisco Bay, thus shielding Mexican California from American expansion while also expanding Russian California itself. It is likely that if this plan went through, the eastern border of Russian California would expand even further to the Sierra Nevada mountains in order to control the rest of the Sacramento Valley and prevent American adventurers from traveling through the mountains. The vast new lands of Russian California would then be populated by Russian serfs in a massive state-led colonization scheme. Zavalishyn submitted his plans in writing to imperial authorities in St. Petersburg, but his proposals were rejected by a committee and failed to convince Tsar Alexander. Russian authorities in Alaska, however, were far more sympathetic to Zavalishyn's schemes and planned to appoint him manager of the Ross colony to implement some of his ideas, although the Tsar intervened in fear that he would provoke a conflict with Britain or the United States. Zavalishyn's plans ultimately lost all credibility when he took part in the liberal Decembrist Revolt of 1825, which was crushed by reactionary loyalists. Zavalishyn was arrested for his part and variously spent the rest of his colorful life as a prisoner, writer, educator, and scientist. In 1833, Russian California was at a crossroads. Fort Ross was not producing enough food to make it a productive colony, costing the Russian-American company money. Russian authorities therefore considered that Fort Ross either be abandoned, ending Russia's venture in California, or expanded to make it a more productive colony. Ferdinand Wrangel, the German-Russian governor of Alaska, traveled to Ross in 1833 to assess the situation, and believed that the latter option of expansion was the best choice. Wrangel's modest plan proposed that Russian California be expanded 58 miles east and 35 miles south, and that Russian serfs be imported to settle, populate, and farm the fertile valleys of the Russian River, now world-renowned for its wine. Unlike the more radical Zavalishyn, the conservative Wrangel proposed that this land be leased to the Russian-American Company by the government of Mexico for 50 years, rather than be outright annexed. A year later, Wrangel expanded his proposition to include Russian sovereignty along the coast from Trinidad Bay in the north to San Francisco Bay in the south. This seemingly sensible plan was received warmly by the Mexican governor of California, Jose Figueroa, who had a good working relationship with Wrangel. However, there was one major problem. The ultra-reactionary Tsar, Nicholas I, viewed the liberal secular Mexican government as illegitimate. It did not want to wish to enter into negotiations with a supposed rebel government. Thus, Wrangel's plans were never implemented. In both Zavalishyn's and Wrangel's plans for the expansion of Russian California, interior ideological politics proved to outweigh practical strategic considerations. The reactionary regime of Russia in the first half of the 19th century killed all plans to consolidate Russian power in California, and Fort Ross stagnated as a colony as a result. Russia finally abandoned California when it sold the struggling Ross colony to the Swiss-American businessman John Sutter in 1841, ending Russian dreams of California and opening the way to American conquest. Thanks for listening to my first video of Odyssey history. If you learned something and liked the video, consider subscribing to get consistent content such as this about the history of exploration, colonization, and empire. Here are some future video ideas of mine that I plan to make projects of in the future. And if you see something that you'd like to learn about, subscribe.